Ladies and gentlemen, I am very, very honored to be speaking at this event where you are looking at very interesting issues related to civil society and the role of civil society in promoting democracy and how social movements are promoting democracy as well as defending civic space. I will share a few insights because I've been given about 15 minutes to do this. And I will want to make sure that I touch on some of the main points, and then we can see through the discussions what else we can do. I think one of the things I would like to say in the beginning is that this is a very interesting topic that one can speak on for quite a long time, but I'll try to keep it within the 15 minutes that the organizers have given me. First of all, I want to introduce myself. My name is Richard Ssewakiryanga. I'm the executive director for the Center for Basic Research. Center for Basic Research is one of the oldest think tanks here in Uganda that does work on socio-economic, political governance, and all other elements of social sciences. But it is also a think tank that is a quasi-academic think tank that delves deep in questions of how society evolves in different ways. Prior to that, I worked also for the Uganda National NGO Forum, as well as the Training Center for Development Cooperation in Arusha. And I also have been recently supporting the Prime Minister in Uganda with some specific advisory position on issues of partnerships. So let me say something about this topic, and what I'll do in order for us to follow through and to keep it short is to share a short presentation so that I can pace myself so that I don't speak for too long over these issues. Now I'll share the screen so that everybody can see my presentation, and then we can move on from there. But I would like to say on the outset, as I work on this, is that the topic or the issues related to civil society, civic space engagement, and what that means is something that many social activists have engaged with this question for decades. And so many of the things I'll be saying will not be new, but what will be new is probably how we reflect about how they are unfolding and the nuances that we have to always engage with when we think about the role of civil society and social movements in promoting democracy and defending civic space within Africa. We know that first and foremost, before I say anything, the preamble is that when you look even at the Civic Monitor by Civicus, the number of countries that are under attack where civic space is shrinking quite a lot across Africa and in many ways. And civic space is shrinking for many different reasons. Some for legislative reasons, others because of outright war, others because of abuse of power in different and nuanced ways, others through some of the legislations, like even the COVID legislations that we had. So there's a huge number of ways in which civic space is being constrained. So the role of civil society, I think, has never been as important as it used to be, because civil society now is really, really in a place where it must stand and be counted, but also find ways in which it can improve how it relates, how it connects, and all that. Now, let me start by defining the landscape. As you all know, when we talk about civil society organizations, there are a diversity of definitions. But largely what we are talking about are the NGOs, the grassroots organizations, the community-based organizations, all those organizations that work tirelessly every day behind the scenes to advocate for causes, to amplify the voices of the marginalized, and even to bridge the gap between citizens and those in power. And really, we all know from the textbooks and all the literature that is out there in defining civil society, that it's indeed that space between the family and the state. And within that, there are hundreds of different configurations of how citizens organize themselves to play a part in the ways in which their societies are organized. Now, social movements on the other side are really the collective. They are the civil society collected together for leveraging what we call collective power of individuals, of organizations to work together so that they can come together on united causes and say that there is a cause here and therefore we want to work on that cause. And that is what we call social movements. They are really the collective power of individuals and groups which unite around a common cause. And social movements represent the spirit of people in action. When we talk about social movement, we are really talking about how people are taking actions by challenging injustice, demanding equality, fighting for human rights, as well as really doing those things that underpin what we know as democracy. Now, of course, when we talk about democracy and promoting democracy, there are many ways in which this is done. But essentially, to promote democracy, we know that the power of empowerment and advocacy is critical. Why? Because in a sense, when the state organizes itself, we as citizens, we do give two things to the state. We give the state our taxes, we give the state votes, so the votes vote for leaders who take over the control of the state. The taxes pay the bills for these leaders to do things on our behalf. But we know that when we do that, the next thing is to ask ourselves, can we ensure that these people in leadership are actually doing the things that they have agreed to do? And that's where the democratic contract comes in between citizens and leadership. And therefore, really, when you look at it, there are three elements that I think for me stand out as very, very important when we talk about promoting a democracy. One is empowering individuals. Now, CSOs empower individuals, and this is a role they take on because one of the ways to promote democracy is to ensure that citizens in their own right know what is going on. And that's why you offer them education, resources, platforms, and many other things that help these citizens to say, oh, we now know what this state is doing, and therefore we can play a role in terms of how this state is doing what it's doing. So that's the first thing that we do when we promote democracy. We empower individuals because at the end of the day, while democracy is about societies, society is about individuals and also groups and also families and also other types of configurations. But the ultimate type of configuration that you want to reach through a democratic process is an individual that is empowered, that enjoys benefits and actually gets as much as they can from what the state is able to offer. The other important part is really advocacy for justice and rights. We know that governments everywhere in the world, left on their own, sometimes can do things which they think are very much in line with helping individuals, and they end up doing things that are an excess, that promote excesses. And so rights, we know, are those that are things that we as citizens should enjoy in any state. And therefore, if you do not take time to actually push for, to make visible some rights, certain individuals who have power sometimes find it convenient to exercise excesses to promote different types of abuses of rights. And so when we talk about social movements, really these are the beating heart of change in terms of saying, okay, if we are to see a just world, what do we need to do? In Africa, here we know that, for example, in many countries, advocating for justice is an everyday ongoing issue. Why? Because in many parts, the states have become excessive in how they use power, in how they abuse power, in how they deploy different ways in which they control rights. And because of that, that's why advocacy for justice and rights is a very central tenet in promoting democracy. Because at the end of the day, every society should really be promoting justice and justice for everyone. And for rights, we know that there are hundreds of abuses that people go through, and yet rights are the thing that make us. We enjoy ourselves, but we enjoy ourselves as individuals through the rights that are there that society gives us to be able to enjoy. The right to speak freely, the right to move freely, the right to control your body, the right to do things that help you to, access services, and all those different kinds of things. So really, advocating for justice and right is one of the things that the cornerstone of how we can promote democracy across this continent. And I haven't gone into so many of the examples because that could take some time, but I would like you to, look through your own communities and societies and say, what do we see when we think about how rights are being, either enjoyed or not enjoyed in different places? We know that, for example, we have seen a spate of coup d'etats in different countries, unconstitutional changes of government. That in itself is an abuse of rights, is an abuse of justice, is an abuse of everything that makes our societies. And so for us in Africa, we have no luxury anymore to say that we don't care so much about how things run. No, everybody, in a sense, has to be an advocate for justice and rights in the different places in which they're. The other thing is how to shape public policy. We know that this whole thing called public policy is one of those things that have to concern us a lot, because indeed, when we talk about public policy, we are talking about how the state has decided to define different ways in which they will deliver the mandate that they have to the people in a state or in a continent or in a jurisdiction. So CSOs really cannot just sit on the side and say, well, you have put up a policy on education, therefore we hope it will work the way it is going to work. No, CSOs have to find time and engage and not just observe on the sidelines, but actually become active participants in shaping policies. Now, shaping policies can be shaped in different ways. You can shape it at the level of design, at the level of implementation, or at the level of how it impacts people in different communities. So at these different points in which a policy unfolds, civic engagement, how citizens engage, is critical. Because for any policy, we know that we, the citizens who benefit from that policy, are the ones who should be able to say, this is how this policy is helping us, this is how this policy is not helping us. So again, this is an area we have to spend time on and engage and try to understand. So civil society really has to play a lot of roles in this whole thing called policy engagement, because public policy affects citizens. And as citizens organizations, you can't run away from making sure that public policy ultimately benefits and doesn't abuse the rights of citizens. Now, there is also a number of things that happen when we talk about defending civic space. Sometimes there are things which civil society does, and many governments and others love, and therefore I think that it's also important to remember that there are many things that roles that civil society plays that are actually about supporting the actual functioning of society, either through relief or through promoting long-term, long-term visions of transformation. But in all these things, when civil society defends civic space, it is really because it wants to play in all these different phases of a citizen's life. So, for example, immediate relief with lasting impact. When we have crises, who turns up first? Usually, it will be the communities and the communities organizations or civil society organizations. Everywhere where there is a landslide, where there is a war, where there is any type of calamity, the first responders are always civil society. Before the big organizations, before the government sometimes turns up, the first responders are usually citizens organizations that come together and say, we want to play a role in this community. So in a sense, that is something that we have to remember as very, very important, because in times of crisis, whether natural disasters or man-made calamities, CSOs are often the first responders that will come to any community. The other thing is that civil society actually plays a very other important role in communities, especially when you think about the long-term vision. And that is when it works to fill the gaps. In places where you find, in some countries, like even in Uganda here, we have communities that have never known the state's presence. And they have had their hospitals, their schools, all being built by non-governmental organizations, church groups, religious organizations, and all those kinds of things. So that is a gap-filling function that civil society plays. And one has to understand that that is in itself a very critical thing, because where governments fall short, CSOs step in. And they provide the essential services. We know they have played roles in healthcare, in education, social welfare, in agriculture, in all kinds of sectors. And sometimes this is the civil society that governments love, because this is the civil society that does the government's work. But we know that that is not what we want. We don't want just to do that. We also want to ensure that the governments that are in power are actually doing the things they are supposed to do. But also, civil society fundamentally must and does champion inclusivity. In a democratic society, we know that discrimination is one of those things and that should not rule our lives. Women's empowerment has been on our agenda for now several decades. And that is a role that has been championed by civil society across this continent. Right from the independence movements to today, you have seen women's movements across the continent engaging on the specific questions on gender empowerment, pushing back on domestic violence, on gender-based violence, on all kinds of things. If you go to other things like minority groups, there has been also consistent engagement to make sure that minority groups that may not be big enough are actually included. This goes to other groups that may not be as powerful, like the youth, like the children. All this championing of inclusivity is very important, because in a democratic society, there is no place for discrimination or prejudice. And so CSOs and social movements really play that crucial role of challenging the societal biases and promoting inclusivity. So as I come to an end, I think we need to ask the question, therefore, how do we focus on navigating the challenges that come with these roles that civil society and social movements play? I think in overcoming the challenges, there are two main challenges that I think I invite you to engage on and speak about and find different solutions in terms of what we can do. One of them is the legal restrictions. We know that in some parts of the world, governments impose restrictions on CSOs, fearing their influence and the truths that they speak. And therefore, we have to always engage with the legal questions to make sure that the country's jurisprudence, as well as the laws and everything else, is aligned to those ethos that promote civic engagement, that promote citizen empowerment, that promote inclusivity. Because indeed, legal restrictions is one of the things that has been used as a tool to engage civil society or to push back on civil society. Funding constraints is also critical. Yes, while we can try and mobilize resources through local philanthropy, through community giving, through all the kinds of things that they do. And in Africa here, some of the biggest philanthropy actually comes from African countries. And so while that is happening, it's happening everywhere. We know that one of the biggest critical challenges that many civil society organizations face is this whole question of constraints on funding. And yet the work of CSOs transcends monetary value. You know, they transcend when you respond in a crisis. Sometimes there is no money that can actually pay for that response. And therefore, while we struggle, we know that the monetary value that CSOs, for the work that CSOs do, is never, accounted for. And this is a constraint that we must overcome. The legal and funding constraints for me stand out as things that I've seen in many countries as critical. The other thing I would like to say is we also need to embrace different types of opportunities. Collaboration. I think that as we go along around Africa, we must find the social movements that bring movements together so that movements on this continent can work together, because the potential for meaningful change is greatest when governments, international organizations, CSOs work together. But as CSOs, we have to find ways in which we work together across this continent, because that is the thing that is going to help us. I spent a few years at the African Union as a presiding officer for the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council. And one of the things that I saw was the ways in which civil society in Africa is disjointed. That indeed, even when it gets these spaces, some of them are being captured by people who are not about collaboration, but are about their individual visibility. And so we have to really push and see how can we come together to ensure that we work together, because the power and the potential meaningful change that comes with collective organizing can never be underestimated. Today, the other big opportunity we have is technological advancement. And this is the thing that will help us even to collaborate more. Advancements in technology in today's digital age. Technology offers powerful tools for us to amplify our voices, to connect people across this continent and globe. Because things like social media, for example, have revolutionized the way movements are organized and the messages are being spread and all that. We've seen that happen in Kenya, here in Uganda, in all over West Africa, North Africa. The instances, the ways in which technology is reshaping our civic engagement with the democracy deficits and dividends is clearly something we must latch on and stay with. So, colleagues, what I would like to say in the end is we have to remember one thing, that democracy is not a spectator sport. It's not an armchair process. It's a collective journey. And that doesn't mean that everybody must be in one place. It just means that everybody plays a part. It's a collective journey, one in which CSOs and social movement play an indispensable role. So we must be relentless. Our efforts must be relentless to defend civic space, to promote justice, to empower individuals. And that is the foundation upon which you can then say we are building democratic institutions. And therefore, we need to unite in our shared purpose. And we should be driven by this vision of a world where we say democracy will, must, should thrive. It may not be thriving today, but that's our vision. We must see it clearly and ensure that we evolve all our actions towards that, to become more inclusive towards that. Because at the end of the day, that is what delivers the society we want. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for listening to me. I have gone a little bit overboard from the time that I was given to share this, but I hope that you have got something out of this message. And I want to wish you a very, very successful, but also fruitful deliberation. I thank you very much for listening to me.